Hey everyone, this is Joe Glines, and we got Jackie.
Hey everyone. Yeah.
And today on our quick chat, we're going to talk about whether you should have your AutoHotkey scripts combined into one or in multiple. It's one of the things when you're new to AutoHotkey, it's very confusing, right? Of like, well, wait a minute, I can have all the stuff in one basically, or I can have separate ones, and how do I keep track of which, and why would I do which one? So we thought this would be a fun, and actually I'm hopeful today this really will be a quick chat, because while it's an interesting topic, I don't think we have to talk too much about the logic behind it. For me, go ahead, Jackie, you're going to say something.
Yeah. I was just going to mention the same thing. I don't believe that there's that much to it, because again, it might, in the end, it might boil down to preference more than anything.
It's preference, and then there's also how much I think you know ahead of time of how you're planning to use them, right? Because there were some things initially I was going with I'm going to have one main script and have everything in it, and then it was later that I realized, like, specific people, they're like, hey, I like that, the pasting is plain text functionality, or my screen clipping tool that I use a lot, and those were both embedded into my main file, and they only wanted that little bit of it. And so it was really a pain for me to go and pull out those parts of them separately, right? And that was one of my biggest ones of like, hey, if I think for any reason someone's going to want just this, right, then I'll keep it as its own thing and just run it as a separate script, and then that way I can just give it to them, right? And it's just so much easier than intertwining it with all my other stuff.
Yeah, and maybe at the beginning, a lot of those that actually ask the question, should I keep it in one or in more? Mm-hmm. Many of them might not actually have gotten to the point where it's really needed to decide. Where I have 5 hotkey routines. Should I separate them? Should I keep them in one? Or I have 5 files where I've made small things, and should I combine them? Is that better? And at least one of the things that one could consider is, if you actually have many files, each time you load a script, you actually load the entire interpreter. And even though it's not that big, mm-hmm. It's still, a megabyte or something loaded into memory?
Yeah, I think a little less, but yeah, around there. Yeah.
Around there. So of course, if you have 50,
right,
that would be a chunk of memory taken away. But if you have a few or a dozen or something like that, in the computers today, it shouldn't really matter.
Yeah. Well, even with 50, right? I mean, if you look at like Chrome or Excel or Outlook, those easily, I think, take up at least 50 megs or so to run, right? Often they're, bigger.
Probably more. So, yeah, I don't even know how much they take. Yeah. I'd say that with the newest version of Word programs and whatever they need to do, Excel and the like, just the amount of time it normally takes for them to actually execute, I'd say they're probably way bigger than that. Yeah.
Yeah, it depends. Then of course there's the file you're opening, the actual file itself instead of the program. But anyway, yeah, it's like you said, today's computers for the most part shouldn't really be an issue anyway. The other thing which I was thinking through of best how to explain it is, we're talking about putting, I don't know how to say this properly, because the other thing to think about is, like, should I use an include and put my functions in a separate file, right? So that's conceptually it's around the same kind of topic, but it's not what we were originally discussing.
No, but it's still a matter of if, let's say, your script gets a specific size, and again, we know that from the beginning, or maybe not from the beginning, but at least the early days of AutoHotkey, the idea of the standard library became a thing where if you stored AutoHotkey files at a specific location in relation to the AutoHotkey interpreter, then that would be taken as a standard location for you to actually place a file. And again, this is all with the mentality of you storing separate functionality in separate files. Or maybe, yeah, in a way, if you have something that you use as a standard, it could be an idea for you to save it in this standard library location. And it doesn't actually have to be in separate files. You could have one file with many functions, but yeah.
Which actually, we're drifting a little here, but it would be an argument of, hey, if you're using the same function in different scripts, right, you can put it into one function in your library folder and reference it from the different scripts. And that way, when you go to update or edit, you're updating one file and not, in the multiple different places, which if it's something like, let's say, an object to string file function to, extract the text from an object, it's nice having it in one spot, and then everywhere it gets updated. You don't have to worry that I need to go find it everywhere in all my different programs or files and fix it, adapt it, update.
Yeah. I'd say one of the things is when a script gets large enough, I'm working on one currently that is probably the largest thing I've ever made. And it might make sense if I went in and broke it apart into different files. The problem for me at this time is, what does it actually give me? What do I save, or what benefit do I get from using the time on separating the one main one? Right. Because the one main script works just great.
Right.
There's no issue with keeping all these many functions and classes and all the things in one file. But if I wanted to, let's say, delegate the work to someone, or if I wanted to quickly make sure I had, let's say, different versions of a functionality, it might make sense for me to have that in a separate file, because then I could have the functionality in version 1 and 2 and so on and so forth, which would be more easy when at least for me, when looking at it, instead of having multiple versions of a single script, I could have multiple versions of subparts of the script.
Yeah, I get you. Yeah.
That's kind of where I'm seeing a benefit to maybe splitting it up into multiple files. But again, to me, it needs to be large enough to have subparts needing that, just like the example you gave earlier, where you have subparts that someone wants, but they don't need all of your functionality. They just need that smaller part.
Yeah.
And that's when it becomes what's beneficial to actually split it into its own file. And I'd say, and you know this, I don't make these enormous collections of hotkeys and hot strings or different routines. I do it very much in separate small entities, and I sit down, I need this functionality. I write it, I save it, I have it for later. And then next time I create a new file and I do it all over again.
So actually, I thought of one other thing that with how you were describing that I use as part of my criteria to decide if I'm going to have it in a separate script or not. And it has to do, actually, interesting enough, with like my screen clipping tool, because initially I didn't use the screen clipping tool that often, and so that was one of the other reasons why I put it in its own file, and that way it wasn't always loaded, and I didn't have, of course, have the hotkey for it, but I could hit a hotkey to launch it, and then I could use it. Well, after I started using it a lot, I realized, man, I use this all the time, so I always wanted it running. But it's still, the whole concept is the same. It's like, hey, if there's something that you actually don't use that often, right, do you really want it eating up a little bit more of your memory, when I can have a hotkey to launch that script in a separate program, and then it runs for when I want, and then I can exit out of it separately, right? And it doesn't kill everything else that I have.
Yeah, and again, it might seem maybe not counterintuitive, but it might seem like it's an extra unneeded step that, hey, you could just have the code there,
Yep.
but you could just as easily have the code somewhere else. And instead of including it or something else like that, you could just run it. You could simply have a run command that says AutoHotkey.exit whatever the interpreter's path is, and then pass your script in as a parameter.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be one line of code in your big master script, whatever. And then you could have the entire functionality separated out. Yeah. And that's also that actually kind of gives you some of what people sometimes wish they had, and that's multi-threading. You could actually have multiple things going on at
That's a good point.
Same time.
Yeah. And along the same lines too, because the one thing, this came up in a webinar I think 2 back, where someone, I think it was, can't think of his name. I want to say Brian. That doesn't quite sound right. It doesn't matter. He said his wife will come up and want to use his computer, and she didn't like the hotkeys. It messed her up, and so he didn't want to quit out of them, right? So he actually had it where he could. He was quitting everything, I think, and he asked for a better solution. And we're like, well, you can right click and say suspend hotkeys, right, on that running script. And that way, if they're separate, it's really easy to do that, right? To just suspend the hotkeys and just have it that way. If there is interaction with other things that are currently running, it's an easy way to work around that. Or of course, you can kill it separately, but you don't have to lose your main script, right?
Yeah, and you could maybe more easily at least have different keys that suspended different parts or different running scripts. That's at least how I see it. So you could have one that was for all your Word functionality that could be suspended by a single click, or you could have a totally separate file for all of your Excel stuff that could also be suspended in the exact same. And of course, you could also build an executor script that runs the other scripts. But again, the idea of separating it out makes sense as soon as you have enough to actually separate. Because if you just have 4 functions, one on F1, one on F2, one on F3, and one on F4, there's absolutely no reason to separate them out if used in the same works.
It'd be pretty painful, honestly, right? It's like, now I got to remember which file and go to it separately versus having one file I can easily, I think that's a really valid point.
Yeah, and of course, if you have issues, if what you do is you work a lot in the global scope with your variables and stuff like that, and you have a lot of, let's say, go-to subroutines where everything still is kept in the global scope, then you might get some issues along the line if you just kept building on the end of one giant script. If you didn't keep a good record of which variables you already had or which variable you needed. And one of the things that people often see is using the clipboard in subroutines for different stuff. If you're doing string manipulation, or if you're storing the content of the clipboard and restoring it later in that routine, the problem begins being that if you interrupt that action, then your script that still is running over here that has something in one variable, you might actually by mistake delete it or corrupt it or something else, because you have everything in one giant script. But again, you need to have enough stuff going on at the same time to have that issue. So again, with the, it depends on how much you're trying to do with your scripts, and maybe at the same time as well.
Another one I thought of, which is it's along the same lines of what we talked about, was, but I did run into a lot when I had a different work computer, than a home computer, and then a kitchen computer, and I still have all these things. But right now, because I don't have the corporate one, things are very similar across computers. But if you're running like I am, I run everything into Dropbox, and so I have the same scripts on everywhere. Yet I don't necessarily have all the same programs on each one. That was another reason why it's easy for me to if I have that functionality broken out in separate scripts, I can choose on each computer whether I want to launch that one script or not, right? Otherwise, if it's all under one script, you have no control over that.
Yeah, that's also the thing with having everything in one script. I don't see many issues from it.
Right.
But I do see just the matter of finding the functionality that you want to change, or again, if it becomes large enough, that might become an issue. And the naming, again, if you use the right editor, you might save yourself some trouble there. If you're just using Notepad or whatever, you might easily run into using the same variable name over and over without ever being notified. But as soon as you run it, variable naming and stuff like that won't be mentioned.
It doesn't care. Yeah,
exactly. So as soon as you start using it, then it becomes an issue if you're somehow overriding your own values somewhere.
So the other thing, which actually we should at least bring up tangentially, is which you mentioned in your really large script. Like, should you start breaking them out separately? And could be time consuming. So in like using Cite, you'd be it's a manual task, right, to break them all out separately. And then if you actually wanted, like, let's say you did it all, but then you had one friend who wanted one file from you'd have to go manually pull them all back in, right? It's a painful or post it to the forum, right? It's a painful process. Whereas if, like, with Studio, AutoHotkey Studio, it has some nice hotkeys where you can highlight it, hit a button, and it'll automatically export it and then write the include for you. And then you can say, I think it's pack. I can't remember what it is, but there's a command you can do that it'll bring all of your includes back into your main script for you when you want to paste it, like, to the forum, or puts them on the clipboard for you. And like, holy cow, right? It streamlines that process incredibly. So it's not so painful. When I started using Studio, it greatly increased the likelihood that I would put a function by itself, because it was a keystroke and that would pull it out. And to your point, though, it isn't like a memory, type performance thing of why you would have the separate files, right? Like you said, those work fine either way, really. It's more about, is it easy to maintain? Is it easy to read? How much, just how you're going to share it with other people or other computers. But it's not the actual, like, this way is programmatically a better solution. No,
exactly. And that's probably the main thing, because the people who often ask it when they're new, they see some thought up issue with doing one over the other,
right?
Or they might have seen someone saying, hey, you should separate it, or if they want to use the same hotkey in multiple functionalities, and they might not know enough about ways to keep such routines separate.
Right.
Single file. It can easily feel like the right solution to separate it.
Yeah. I was, because that's a good example we didn't talk about, was if you wanted to use the same, like, let's say Control T, to do two different things, some people would say, well, I'm going to put those in different scripts, and then I'll launch that script and use Control T while that's running. But we know, generally speaking, you want Control T to work probably in a specific program, and you could make it context sensitive to say, hey, when I'm in this program and I hit Control T, do this, versus if I'm in a different program, then it's all in one script, right? It's fine.
And again, it's something that you learn along the way. So that
Right.
kind of becomes a non-issue. But as a beginner, at least, it's something that you think about. And again, it comes down to a lot of the first knowledge that you need to kind of accumulate to work with these scripts more efficiently along the way. And most people, they believe that a computer is always multi-threaded, or because they can think of things rapidly in between each other. It should
Yeah.
be easy for it to do what I do when I press Control T, and then it will just loop over this, and it does something each minute or whatnot. But I also have the need for it to kind of go in circles over here.
Yeah.
So
At the same time. Yeah.
press Control F and start that routine. Those two can of course run at the same, but no, they can't. Not in the same script.
Yeah.
But if you had separated them out into two scripts, then you would actually be able to do it.
Yeah.
And but that would probably give you other issues because
Right.
yeah,
Depending on what they're doing, but yeah.
yeah.
So I think in summary, right, first off, do what you want for the most part, right? As long as it works. There is no right and wrong answer. I think the second one I would say is think through a little bit about your plans of how you plan to actually do whatever, and review our discussion of what we just said is like, it depends, it depends on how you're planning to use it. But there is no
As a beginner, it might be a good idea to keep it in one, because you can easily reference what you did the last time or just above or whatnot. And in the long run, you'll most likely create multiple scripts anyway. So, yeah.
Cool. Awesome. All right. I think we actually kept it to a short chat. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's great.
All right, Jackie. It was good talking to you.
Yeah. Bye.